Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this breakout session. I am your host, Mogusu. Momanyi is my name. And we're going to have on board our speaker this mid-morning breakout session, Jayne Morrison. Thank you for joining us. She's the regional manager, Middle East, Africa, and India, 6 seconds. One Jayne Morrison is passionate about maximizing potential of human capital by utilizing emotional intelligence to bring about value and performance in organization. She's still moving is our conversation this breakout session. And Jayne, welcome on board. We'd like to learn from you about successfully navigating change.
Yes, I'm speaking to you. So change is really interesting, and I'm in the process of change right now because I'm a Zoom girl and I'm suddenly faced with presenting to all of you lovely people on WebEx. So you're going to have to bear with me while I navigate the change of this session.
Don't you be worried. We're happy to have you.
And your microphone is on. Please mute it so that we don't have the background noise going and disturb people's listening.
Thank you.
Right now, aside from me being in this little cycle of change from Zoom to WebEx, we're in the midst of a huge era of change. As Josh mentioned this morning in his session, this, for most of us, is probably the biggest era of change we will face in our lives. And if you're feeling uncertain and you're feeling anxious, that's because you're paying attention, because your brain's primary purpose is to focus your attention, and your emotions cause you to focus attention. People really in the history of mankind have experienced this level of collective emotions where we are so focused on this uncertainty, so anxious about what's next. We no longer know where the cheese is today, let alone where the cheese is going to be tomorrow. So as we start, I'd like you to take a minute for yourselves and consider a change you're currently in. It possibly might be a change related to this COVID era, but it might be something else. It might be personal or it might be professional. And I'd like you to take a moment and just think about that. Write it down. Make a note about it. A current change that you're facing. So the reality is that 70% of change fails. And that doesn't matter whether it's personal change or organizational change. 70% of change fails to achieve its overall objective. So when you've written down the change you're in and what success looks like, what is it going to take for you to stay in the 30%, for you to actually succeed in making that change for yourself, for your clients, for your organization, or your community? The general assumption around change, is number one, that it's linear, that there is a start and an end, that we make a plan and we stick to it. And then we get to the end of it and it's done. Well, actually, change is cyclical. We are always in the middle of change. We are consistently changing. And if we don't stay in that change cycle, we're going to die out like the dinosaurs. We're going to become redundant, like some of the products of the past. Change is constant. Number two, change is rational. Now, from this mindset, you're going to hear people saying, this is the plan. Everybody get on board the plan. And then when people don't jump on the plan, you'll hear some super rational person saying, no, you don't understand. Let me just explain it to you again. This is what you have to do. And yes, a good explanation can help. But the central issue is is that change is really based on data. Just for example, if somebody wants to lose weight, if we start lecturing them on not eating French fries and choosing salad as an alternative, they know this data. And then no matter how many times we tell them, it's not going to make them stick with the change, because change is not just about rational intelligence. It's not just about data. And the third assumption is that change is driven by systems and processes. Now, these are really important. It's really important to have the right processes in place, to put the right systems in place, regardless of whether it's a personal change you're wanting to make or if it's a workplace change. But if they're not the only issues that are at stake, because if people don't come on board, people don't buy into the change, it's not going to work. For example, imagine an organization that decides it's going to improve communication. We're going to put in a new feedback initiative into the organization. But then because trust is so low in the organization, nobody is prepared to take the risk to use the feedback process. Change won't happen unless people are on board. Very often in organizations, people come up with a wonderful change strategy, a wonderful plan of moving ahead. And they put this plan in paper, they hire expensive people to support them organizing the plan and putting it into action. And they forget that it's actually people who will drive the process. It's emotions that drive people. And when we put a plan into action, we require people to come on board. But in order for people to come on board, we have to support them in creating a change, which means we need to support them in creating a new emotional transition to the new state, which means rewiring their brains, getting them to think, feel, and act differently. So what is change? Change is actually a process of learning. And our change model is an action learning model. The concept of action learning was originally introduced in hospitals. It's a way of creating continuous improvement. Now, remember, I said to you that change is a continuous process. It's a continuous iterations of changes. The idea here is that, first of all, you think about something, you start making a plan, you engage in the process. Then you dig in and start activating, you experiment and try things out. And then you step back and reflect on what's happened. This sets you up to go into the next iteration and the next and the next. Very often when we plan, we spend so much time planning that we never get into it. Whereas this action learning process of change gets us shifting and moving. So if you think about the change that you wrote down a few minutes ago, where are you in this cycle right now? Where are you in that cycle? Are you still thinking, planning? Are you already trying it out? Practicing new skills, new ways of thinking, feeling, acting? Or are you somewhere past that and looking back at what's happened already? Regardless of which stage you're in, write down 3 or 4 emotions about what you're feeling about this change. I'm not going to ask you to share them with anyone, so you can be as truthful as you like. 3 to 4 emotions that you're currently feeling in this change, about this change. What are they? So as I mentioned, change is not just a rational process. And one of the reasons that 70% of change fails is because people resist. Central to this change process is this concept of resistance, is the fact that often when we talk about change, and let's face it, we've heard so much about change gurus, about change theories, that change has become a dirty word. And when we think about change, very often we go into the cycle of resistance. You can't change people because as soon as somebody says, you've got to change, you can't force it. They'll say, why, what, when? You feel this feel of frustration. Oh, who's trying to tell me to change? Oh my God, if I change, what's going to happen? Will I lose my job? Will something else happen? Judgment, I've done it before, it'll never work, we've tried it out. And these emotions create an away brain state. So our brain, the focus then is on how quickly can I move out of this situation? What can I do to get away from it? How can I get away to stopping it? And you can see that in the circle that on my slide, the arrows are all pointing backwards, out, away. These feelings, these emotions push change backwards. They delay it or cause it to be completely derailed. So look at the feelings you wrote down. Would they fit in this cycle? Now, these are not bad feelings because there are no good or bad feelings. We really believe that feelings are just data. They are just data. And as Josh was saying this morning, they serve a purpose. If we're feeling frustration or fear or judgment, there is a reason for it. You don't just feel a feeling for no reason at all. And if we're feeling one of these, they're saying to us, uh-oh, think about it, look before you leap, don't just jump off the cliff, be cautious. And right now in this world of uncertainty and anxiety, a lot of our feelings are in the midst of this cycle. We are feeling uncertain, we're feeling fearful. We're feeling frustrated about what's going on. Our liberties are being impacted. And we are judgmental about the rules and regulations that are being enforced on us. And in this moment in time, it's really hard for us to move into the change. So just as these are these feelings of resistance, there's also feelings that fuel change. And we call this a cycle of engagement. And these emotions include emotions like excitement, courage, curiosity. These emotions cause a toward brain state. This is when like, yeah, I want to get with this change. I'm really excited about it. I feel courageous. I'm open to trying things out. And hey, I'm curious about what the future looks like. As I mentioned, we call these the cycle of engagement. They're the type of emotions that fuel innovation, risk-taking, and they help people stay open to new ideas and new learning. So again, look at the emotions that you wrote down about your change. Do they fall here? The challenge is that when we go into a change process, we cannot just choose which emotions we're going to feel. The emotions happen within us. And it's sort of this emotional seesaw. We have emotions that cause us to stop, block, or resist change. And we have emotions that engage, move us forward. So which emotions are you on? Which side of the seesaw are you on in terms of your change? Are your emotions telling you to pause, reflect, think about it? Or are the emotions saying, hey, get with it, move forward? So if we bring the two cycles together, we'll see this change map. And in this model of change, we've combined the three ideas, the three key principles that I mentioned. Number one is that change is cyclical. And every time you go round the cycle, you're building up the energy and the insight to go through it again. Feelings are the fuel that actually resist or move us forward in the change process. And our job when we're moving through change or when we are leading change in an organization is to support these emotional transitions that you can see from the red lines there. To support people moving from frustration to excitement, from fear to courage, from judgment to curiosity. Because unless people are shifted into the cycle of engagement, change will not happen. Change will fall into that 70% that fails to achieve its ultimate objective. What happens when we are sitting in this cycle of resistance is we start falling into this pattern of blame, this pattern of working in silos, this pattern of the grapevine, of rumor milling. And we know what happens in organizations when that starts to fuel. And emotions are contagious. So those will grow. But we also know that as a leader, we have emotional power over the people that we work with. We have emotional power from the status of our position. And we can work with people to help and shift them. Starting point is that we need to listen. We need to listen and we need to hear the emotions, both those that are being spoken and those that we can see in the body languages of people around us. Because when people are in that cycle of resistance, they need to be heard. They need to be heard and listened to. And when they're in that state of resistance, they need you to build that feeling of psychological safety, that feeling of trust and trustworthiness. Because if there is only this much trust in an organization, with you, with leaders, then you can only do this much change. And all too often, one of the reasons that change gets derailed is that there's only this much trust, but organizations try to make this huge momentous change, and it will not happen. Because without trust, change won't happen. Trust is one of the basic fuels that will actually help shift this model. So if we were to flatten the model out, because sometimes it's easier to see it as flat, so it's a cycle, but if we flatten it out, it looks something like this. Engage, activate, reflect, and you would go through this time and time again in a change process. So in this engage stage, the point is here to get people to buy in, to build acceptance towards the next step. So it's thinking about things like who's involved. What are some of the patterns and dynamics in our organization? What are some of my personal patterns and dynamics? You know, if I'm leading this, am I somebody who's very directive? Do I run too fast? How change ready are other people in the organization? What metrics can help establish a baseline? Is there something that we can use so we know where we are and give us an indication of where we want to go? What are some of the first goals that would be accepted? What are some of the small steps that we can take to bring people with us? And how are we going to communicate that? So these are really key questions to plan as you plan this engagement phase. Activate. So remember, this is about getting in there, getting people to try out, to experience success. What new knowledge, skills, attitudes do we need to build within our workforce? What do people need? What do I need in order to be part of the change? How are we going to develop them? And once we've developed them, how do we maintain focus? What support will people need? What support do I need? And then last not least, lock-in wins. Once we get there, how will we measure the progress? So if we put a measurement criteria in at the beginning, then it's easy. We repeat and check so we can lock in the wins. How can we bring awareness of this change to the organization to build momentum? How can we share it with people? And what's next? Because remember, this is just one iteration of multiple iterations. So when we look at this model in terms of organizational change or personal change processes, the question is, well, how do we use it? How do we put this into action? And regardless of whether it's personal change, coaching, individual people, coaching groups or teams, or bringing in an entire organizational change strategy, there are 6 specific steps to follow. So the first step there in terms of this enrollment, getting people on board, engaging them, you need to enroll people. Create a possibility of change. Create a common vision that actually talks to people, that unites them widely, so that there's this common thread between people and they feel the vision. Remind them that they're more similar than different, that they're all part of the vision. They're not just breaking up widgets or making widgets, but they're actually serving a purpose to achieve something. And this is where really tying in what the job is, what the change is, to the greater purpose of the organization, to the organization's noble goal is really important to get people on board. Listen deeply. You start the emotional shift, those emotional transitions, by getting people to feel they are being listened to. And if you succeed in these 2 hugely important steps, then you create buy-in to the plan. Once you've done this, the next part is just putting together just enough of a plan so that you can start the process and get people moving with you. When this happens, your job is to start increasing capacity, developing those new skills, new awareness to move the change forward. You're working to have people experience success. Remember that you feel people possibly were feeling judgmental and fearful and frustrated. So you want them to start feeling that, hey, I can do this. I have the capacity to do it. I'm not afraid to try it out. But in order to be not afraid to try it out, they need to feel psychologically safe. So underpinning it all, there needs to be trust in the organization. And as I mentioned earlier, trust is the bedrock for successful change. People not change from fear. The stick approach went out the window a long time ago, because what happens with the stick approach, people go, what can I do to get away from this? It's too scary. They're going to be mean to me, etc. And you do it, but you don't do it willingly. So all the time you've got one foot on the brake, stopping this cycle of change. So as we support people in developing new skills, we're also supporting them with possibilities. We're actually supporting them to try it out and experiment with what they learned. But people won't take the risk to experiment unless they feel psychologically safe. So a key point in this process constantly is feeling, listening, checking in with people. In the reflect phase, so now we've gone through, we've engaged, we've activated and tried it out. So now we step back and we think about, well, what's happened? And let's lock in the wins. What can we learn to move us into the next state, into the next phase to progress? So here we're looking at what's happened and bringing it to the surface. What are our successes? And what are our learnings from this? Remember, there's no such thing as failure. There's only learning. If Edison had thought he'd failed, we'd never have light bulbs. He learned every time he didn't succeed. And it's the same brain state that we need to bring to an organization. That success and learning are both valuable in the process of change. And then finally, reimagining the future. So now we've got this far, what's next? Where can we move to in the next phase? So to sum it up, it looks like this. Engage, getting people enrolled in the vision, getting them with you, moving them from that feeling of frustration, we've done it before, I've been here before, to like, wow, yeah, I want to be part of this change. I'm really curious to see where the organization's going. What part am I going to have in this? To, oh gosh, I don't know if I can do it. Maybe I won't be good enough, and feeling a bit fearful, to, hey, I'm going to try it out. It's okay. I feel safe in this environment to be able to do it. And the courage to try it out in that activate stage. And then as we get to reflect, moving from judgment of, it's failed, we didn't do well enough, we didn't achieve our objective, to like, now that's curious. What have we succeeded in? And what have we learned to help shift us into the next cycle? So based on this very, very brief introduction to our change map and our process of change, of moving people through present change era, future change eras, personal change, professional change, what do you need to do differently in terms of equipping yourself to deal with change, to be the change leader that you could be? So I'm curious to hear from you in the chat. I don't know if I can actually see chat anywhere, but I'm curious to hear from you about what you need to do differently to stay in the 30% and ensure that your change is one that succeeds. So could we go back and see some chat? Is that possible somewhere? I feel like I'm talking in the dark here, because I can only see my screen. Mogusu, is there somehow to see the chat and ask people to put some answers to this question in there?
Okay, dear participants, what do you need to do differently to stay in the 30%? Please post your comments on the chat. Please don't unmute, but please post your comments on the chat.
I'm also very happy if you have questions, please write them in the chat as well. I'm happy to answer those too. But I'm really curious to know that, considering where we are at the moment and considering this huge era of change, what do you feel you need to do more? Edith, oh, I can see them.
You can see them?
Sarah, trust goes both ways.
Mm-hmm.
Listen, build trust, and be aware of our own other emotions. Let me see if I can see the chat.
Yes, I can see them. I need to be cautious of the stage I am at so that I am aware of what's going on. That's from Victor. Connect people I work with from Baje, Chipafa, thank you. Stay the course and learn from failures. Thank you for your comments. I believe she's okay. Listen more and follow your emotions. Thank you. All right. Stay focused and engaged as part of the change map. And remember that there is no such thing as failure. Keep moving forward. Most importantly, to trust yourself. From Sharon, thank you so much. Fully feel the emotions and interpret that data to embrace change. Thank you from Laron, South Africa. And role support from Ruth Kinyua. Thank you. Accept the change is inevitable. Do not resist and adopt to the change. Okay, thank you so much, Jayne. I like the comments. Our participants are alive and you're fully participating through their comments. Thank you so much for your comments.
May I answer some? I don't know, do I have time?
Yes, please go on, Jayne.
Okay. So, Rose, I like the idea of reimagining the future. This is a really, really important part of the change process because it really falls into that engaged cycle. Because as we reimagine the future, you know, we are building the excitement for the next cycle. And, you know, so as people start, it builds momentum. And I don't know what your role is with your roles in HR or your roles as a consultant or your role as a coach. This really is our opportunity to move people into the next cycle of engagement with us. So if you're a consultant or a coach, it's a great way of getting your next engagement with your client. Yeah, there's nothing like failure, just learnings. Really, really important. In role support, I think that's you, Thandi, who said that. And you know, one of the most powerful competencies in emotional intelligence is optimism, because optimism is about creating hope and possibility. And when people are in this state of anxiety, when people are feeling uncertainty, they need hope. They need someone to come in and shift and that provide them with that sense of hope. And the optimism is at the heart of that. And it is the most powerful of all the competencies. So if you're struggling with moving through change, optimism is the way to go, is to build your feeling of hope and imagine new possibilities. Accept that change is inevitable. Absolutely. You know, when I think about change and I have people resisting it, I always think to myself, do they want to end up like the dinosaurs? And I tell myself that as well when I feel resistance to using WebEx, when I've always used Zoom. I said, Jayne, don't be a dinosaur. What happens if it is clear to people on the shop floor that leaders are uncomfortable with emotions and therefore blocks the self-expression of any wireless? Yeah, Rose, that's a really, really tough situation. And, you know, that's when the leader himself needs to be given the opportunity to grow. Mm-hmm. And, you know, in the activate stage of change, one of the things is to look at what skills, attitudes people need. And very often, it's not just the people on the floor that need new skills or ways of thinking. It's actually the leaders themselves. They are just as likely to feel frustration, fear, and judgment as other people on the floor. And sometimes they need someone who can support them in making the transitions. Because if they don't believe in it and they don't buy into that change, they are going to be causing the resistance that's going to be spilling out onto the ground floor.
Jayne, there's another question here. How do you address with leadership if you don't agree with change, with a change?
Sorry, how do you what?
How do you address with leadership if you don't agree with a change?
That's interesting. I think, you know, it's about open, direct conversation. You know, gather your courage, gather your facts, your figures, and find out, you know, have an open dialogue. You know, and sometimes we can have the open dialogue to move the change forward. And sometimes we need to accept that the change is going to happen regardless. And there's a huge power in acceptance. So, you know, we can't force things one way or the other, but sometimes we have to reach a point of acceptance. But open dialogue, having the courage to have the dialogue is hugely important in the change process.
Thank you. Our questions, we've done all the questions. Thank you for your comments, dear participants. Jayne Morrison, you can proceed.
Okay, so I'm not sure how much longer I've got. Do you know how long our session is going for? I thought I owed 30 minutes.
Let's keep going. I'll update you on time. Don't worry.
But my session was only a 30-minute session, so please tell me, what would you like me to talk more about?
Okay, proceed and finish your presentation.
Okay, so this question here about what do you need to do differently to stay in the 30% is the last question I wanted to ask the group. I wanted the group to share in terms. Jayne, please display the slide with the flat. Okay, sure, Wanjira. I'll go back to that for you. There you go. Okay. Wanjira, can you see that?
Yes, we can see it. To all our participants.
Specific question, Wanjira.
Thank you for sharing, Jayne. The buy-in plan is here, and I think Wanjira is able to have a view of that. And please, Wanjira, you can snip it and save it, and hope Jayne will be able to share her presentation with us. And to all our participants, please share in your questions. It's time for Q&A, so please share in your questions right now. We have some few minutes to wrap up. In the next 5 minutes, which will be done.
Jayne, thanks, I saw it.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, Libby, I think that I know that you work in the educational area, you work with teachers, and I think this idea of reimagining the future, because right now, you know, the change that's come into education in this last 3 months of kids learning at home, of parents being far more integrated into their learning and the impact of what that's brought into family life has been huge. So what does the future look like for learning? Will our children go to school from 8 until 4 o'clock, or will we start having part-time learning? What does the future hold? And I think it's just so powerful to imagine all the possibilities. Thank you, Sharon. I don't know about recordings. I've absolutely no idea. If you ask Mucha or Natasha or one of the organizers, they might be able to tell you.
Yeah, there's an ongoing recording, so we will communicate that to them. Thank you.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well,
there's a question here, Jayne. Could you speak about them those going through changes that are not necessarily in corporate or team related?
Okay, so Sharon, do you want to clarify on that question? Could you speak about those going through changes? Are you talking about personal changes in terms of?
I didn't put the money, let me get it.
I beg your pardon? Hello?
We need clarity from Sharon, please. Yes, personal changes, Jayne.
Personal change. So Sharon, this change map applies just as much to a personal change as it does to a professional change. If you think about the map here, very often when we go into a change, we have a high level of enthusiasm and a high level of expectation. And somewhere along the line, when we hit the first hiccup, when things don't go as smoothly as they're planned, it gets a bit tedious, it gets a bit time consuming and a bit annoying in the change. We fall into the cycle of resistance. Mm-hmm. So imagine, for example, that you want to increase your well-being. So you've decided to eat more healthily and, I don't know, go to the gym a few times of the week. And then things start happening outside your circle. So Corona hits us and we can't go to the gym because they close out. So how can I do exercise? Oh, I can't really do exercise. It's not possible at this moment in time. So we start to give up. We start to actually give in. And that stops us moving through this process. So we can apply this change map exactly to personal changes as we can to professional or team changes in organizations. We need to engage, we need to think about what do we need, and then to think about, well, actually, how can we do it? What skills, techniques can I put in place to support myself in this personal change? And then, hey, you know what? Sometimes I'm going to fall down, sometimes I'm going to slip up, but what have I learned from that? So as opposed to, if we apply this, it's a much more supporting process of change than thinking, okay, well, I didn't do it right, so it's an end. No, hey, I've done some things well, and what can I learn from where I didn't do? Okay, so let me move into the next cycle. Change is really, really tough, and one of the reasons that organization and personal change fails is that to actually get people on board with the change, we need to rewire the brains. And to do that, we need to lay down new neural pathways. So it takes time and effort, and we've got to exercise the muscles and go through this change map repeatedly in order to get there.
Jayne, it's a wrap. I have 2 questions for you before we move to the main meeting room for the panel discussion. So here we go. We all are facing change that is fueled by the same thing, but different experiences and types of changes. How do we sympathize with different changes we are all going through, Jayne?
Sorry, I beg your pardon. Can I just read that? We're all facing changes that is fueled by the same thing, but different experiences and types of change. How do we sympathize with different? So that is all about this curiosity. Because, as human beings, we tend to move into judgment. And as we go into anxiety and uncertainty, we go more and more and more into our pattern of judgment. I'm right and other people are wrong. And we need to sort of build this shift in terms of, okay, I'm curious about what other people are thinking. I'm curious about how they're dealing with that. And that's a really big emotional shift, as opposed to saying one way is the right way. Hey, there's multiple ways of dealing with this. So it takes empathy and curiosity. Or maybe it's curiosity plus empathy, but it's those two that make that shift out of judgment.
Thank you, Jayne, for the feedback. There's a final from Wanjira. Jayne, how could we build more courage in the face of so much uncertainty and lack of data to help in decision making? Good question.
How can we build more courage in the face of so much uncertainty and the lack of data to help in decision making? By celebrating successes, even if they're teeny weeny, and when people take the risk to try something out and it doesn't work, to celebrate the learning that comes out of that. Because that's what builds courage. Because when people are vulnerable enough to take a risk, we need to celebrate the fact that they have had that courage to do that and not focus on what went wrong, but focus on how can we learn from that. So for example, it would be a case of, Mogusu, that was really courageous for you to try that out. What have we learned from that? As opposed to, Mogusu, that hasn't worked. Oh, for goodness sake, can't you do something differently next time? And unfortunately, that's what we do all too often. So it's about celebrating the courage that people had to take the risk. And that builds that momentum of risk taking. It all goes back to having this environment of trust and safety.
Thank you, Jayne. I'd like to read one comment from Rose Kariuki that's really impressive. This is great. There is a global movement around inequality and race relations. And many organizations are reimagining their values, policies, and exploring their or our unconscious biases. A critical change moment. I mean, we have experienced this throughout. Just yesterday, Coca-Cola pulled out their advertising campaigns for the next 30 days on Facebook because they're requesting Facebook to be up and change, and change in terms of how humans are relating today. There's so much empathy, so much love. So there's no room for hate. And I'm glad organizations are reimagining and changing their values. So thank you, Jayne. We appreciate about that. At least you could give a comment about how organizations are changing their values and policies, especially when it comes to advertising on cleaner platforms.
I think that right now we are in such an era of change, and I think that as human beings we have the opportunity to have the courage to stand up and speak out. And collectively, you know, there's a huge power in the power of one. And when one and one come together, there's amazing power. And right now, globally, so much power in the collective stance against, you know, past and towards future new values.
Okay. Thank you, Jayne, so much for your sharing. Thank you, our participants, for joining on board. Thank you for this great, meaningful conversation that is really in time to study about change and how we go around change. You know, how do we enroll people? How do we motivate people? How do we pull people together? How do we share the vision? How do we share the roadmap together? What values do we instill in them? How do we share? How do we listen to our as leaders? How do we listen to our employees or those who are following us? An important conversation. Jayne, Morrison, thank you for your time so much.
Thank you
for creating this time to share with us. We thank you so much. Our dear participants, let's go back to the main room for the panel conversation. Thank you so much for being part of this. And we're always looking forward to have more conversation with you, Jayne. Maybe you can give us a parting shot, Jayne?
No parting shot from me today, other than to say that I am in awe of the change that's going on at the moment. And I think this map is something that supports us all. And, you know, be aware that we drift from both the resistance to the engagement all the time, all of us. We have multiple emotions. We just need to make sure that we support ourselves as well as others through this change process.
Thank you so much, Jayne, for your time. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your brilliance. And thank you for your rich information. I will applaud all of us as we live our lives to stand forevermore. Let's reimagine the future. Let's see what change we can bring in our society, especially to our children and those children of our children. Thank you so much. You have a great time, everyone.
Thank you, Mogusu.